This episode of New Politics was released on the 24th of September, 2022, and produced on the land of the Wangal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, life returns to normal and the conversation moves over to the budget, the stacking of the boards, and the long road towards the Republic. How will Australia get there? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis. Sorry I'm late. I had 400 meetings with just myself to go to this morning.
And if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through a Patreon subscription. Whether it's a subscription or if you just want to listen in, read our material online or buy a t-shirt or buy a book, it's all available at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The Anglo world has been consumed by royal events in Britain over the past week, but just like rust, politics never sleeps, and more important events do have to continue in Australia, and so it was with the budget preparations. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has been preparing the public for a horror budget, announcing that there will be a substantial but temporary tax increase in the budget, although he's also suggesting that there's been a $50 billion improvement in the budget figures since May this year due to some cost cutting and improvements in iron ore commodity trade. The media and the federal opposition has already started going on about what these temporary and substantial tax increases might be. It just seems like we can't really have a mature debate about taxes in Australia, especially when it comes to a Labor Party being in government. But is this the best time to be raising taxes, David?
The balance of tax goes the wrong way. We have an iniquitous GST that hits poorer people. We have lower rates for higher earners. Now, I'm not sure that I'm of the school that says that once you earn over X amount, anything over that amount should be taxed at 100%. But I think the bigger earners, who make up a large percentage of the money in Australia, could be hit harder. It goes down to things too. We don't actually have to tax individuals more. Corporations tax. We have massive companies not paying tax. Rupert Murdoch disingenuously argued that, well, his employees pay tax, so why should he? An appalling and awful approach. It is the Australian Commonwealth who owns the mining assets in Australia, and yet we basically give it to big foreign corporations and Australian corporations, but only the big ones, without really taking a fair share. And the fear is that these people will go elsewhere overseas. Well, if they do, someone else will come in. Even at a high tax rate, it's still pretty good money. And if the market turns and we can't rely on mining, well, that's fine. We retrain the miners into something else, or we find other things to mine. It's not easy, but it's not an impossible thing, and it's probably something that we need to think about sooner rather than later anyway. There seems to be a lack of courage within the current government to do anything about tax, and a comprehensive reform of the tax system is well overdue. Australia's got one of the most complicated tax laws in the world, and it's all filled with exceptions and excuses from having to pay tax, some of which, to be fair, are reasonable. Others are totally outrageous. And really, if the government was serious about it, they'd say, right, sit down, work out what are the unfair taxes, and not listen to big business, but also listen to middle income earners, low income earners, small business, and others, and come up with a much better taxation system than the current rat's nest of legislation we have at the moment.
Well, if only there was a Henry review that the government could look forward to.
I know. Henry had its issues, but it was an improvement.
Well, there's always one issue that's guaranteed to cause mass hysteria in Australia, and more so than any other countries, and that's the idea of taxes. And whether that's taxes on beer and cigarettes, or carbon taxes, or mining taxes, taxes on wealthy people, taxes on multinationals, the responses from conservative media is always going to be the same. But what they never point out is that when they attack the Labor Party for being big on taxes and big spenders, is that the highest tax in government as a percentage of gross domestic product in the post-war era have been the Howard government. That was 23.5% tax to GDP ratio. The Turnbull government at 22.4%. And the Morrison government towers over all of them at almost 28% of GDP. And they, of course, did have to manage a lot of business bailouts and the JobKeeper support during the pandemic, but even without that, they would have been the highest taxing government ever. And they also left behind $1 trillion national government debt. And of course, that's just how the media runs anyway, but just wanted to point out that all of the negatives that are attached to high taxes always get attributed to the Labor Party, even though it's the Liberal Party that seems to be the one that collates the higher taxes and then fritters it away. But my point is that it's not so much about who's collecting the highest amount of tax or whatever that might be, but how effectively that tax is being spent. And I don't think that's been too effective over the past 9 years, but I do think that tax rises, and I'm not sure if I'm being too optimistic here or a little bit naive, but tax rises can be justified to the electorate if they can see the need for it. And that's where the political framing comes into play. Jim Chalmers, to me, he seems to be framing tax rises in the right tones. The electorate understands that there's $1 trillion national government debt out there. They've lived through the pandemic over the past few years. Here's Jim Chalmers outlining some of the issues.
We speak frequently about the 5 big growing areas of spending in the budget, which are creating pretty substantial structural concerns. Health, NDIS, aged care, defence, and the cost of servicing $1 trillion in debt, all of those costs are growing fast, and that's a combination of the unavoidable and the desirable. And so we do need to have a conversation about that. Now, the first budget in October will be pretty standard, pretty solid, a bread and butter budget, but there are multiple opportunities in multiple budgets over the course of the next 3 years or so for us to properly engage the people in a proper national conversation about the services that we provide and how we fund them.
I'm not suggesting that the media or the opposition is going to play along with all of this, and they're absolutely not, but pushing the idea that these are difficult times and need difficult remedies, and pushing the idea that substantial taxes will be temporary, even if this probably won't end up being the case, I think this is probably the best way to manage this process politically at the moment.
The thing too is that with the $1 trillion debt, there's nothing to show for it. It's not as if there was a large infrastructure improvement. The maligned by the right Rudd school halls project and insulation project gave us new school halls, which a lot of schools were crying out for. I know that there were some schools who didn't want a new school hall, but most schools were crying out for. And in a lot of those cases, the schools that didn't want a school hall actually got an improved facility. And the so-called pink bats, which brought down electricity prices far more than Tony Abbott ever did. So it's not the debt that's the issue, it's what did they spend it on? And they spend it on pork barrelling, rorting, and not much more.
Oh, well, that's absolutely right. But politics is always going to come into play when we're talking about budgets and taxes. The Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, he's been suggesting that the Coalition handed over an excellent economy to the Labor government. Not too sure if a national government debt of $1 trillion with not much to show for it, or stagnant wages, or high inflation, or a recession is the best economy to hand over. But the Labor Party will have its narrative, so the opposition needs to have its political framing as well. And I'm also not too sure if Angus Taylor is the best one to listen to. He was the energy minister who always claimed that greenhouse emissions were going down, even when they were going up. Here's one of our favourite Angus Taylor moments with Barry Cassidy from 2019.
Emissions are up over the last 5 years, not down.
Well, actually, the latest greenhouse gas report that came out last week says that emissions are down by over 1% in the electricity sector, which is in my area.
They're up by 1% over a year.
No, you're wrong, Barry. And a report came out last week saying they are coming down. And
this is the Energy Department report.
No, this is the greenhouse gas inventory report.
Yes.
They are coming down, and the department rightly believes they're going to continue to go down, and the result of this is we will reach not just our Kyoto targets, and we're still in the Kyoto period, we will reach our Paris targets.
Are you talking about total emissions across the economy?
Total emissions are coming down right now.
They're up by 0.9%
Barry,
over the year.
In the last quarter, they've come down 1.5%.
Not a quarter. Over the year, they're up by 0.9%, and they have increased every year for the last 5 years.
Well, they are coming down right now, Barry. And if we go right back, when we got into government...
That's not what the figures say.
Well, I'm telling you what the figures were from the report that came out last week, and you should have a read of that report, because 1.4% down, 3.5% down in the electricity
You're relying
sector.
on one quarter, where for the last 5 years the figures have shown an increase.
Hang on, Barry.
Angus Taylor is one of those members that should have never been allowed anywhere near a seat, particularly after it turned out the type of person he was. Actually, on paper, I can see why you might give him pre-selection, but after it, he tried to set up to basically steal all the water on the eastern seaboard. He should have been deselected and possibly even investigated and charged. That he is shadow treasurer shows just how dire straits the Liberal Party is in at the moment.
Oh, well, it also seems that he's transferred that same approach that he had as Energy Minister over to Shadow Treasury. And I think while that might work while you're a minister in government, I don't think it works so well when you're in opposition. And with that improvement in the budget bottom line of $50 billion, Angus Taylor claims that that's because of the previous government, not because of Labor. Sky News is also pushing the same lines, that nothing ever good comes from a Labor government, and if it actually does or miraculously somehow happens, it's always because of the Liberal Party. And I think we just have to ignore that. That's just the usual banter that we get from conservative media. But if we had a more mature approach to taxation in Australia, there'd always be the ready-made solutions to budget problems. And we've got quite a few budget problems at the moment. A super profits tax, which most people seem to agree with, except for those people that will be making those super profits and would be paying that super profits tax. Multinational taxes, possibly the consumption tax with the tax credit structure to make them more equitable for lower income people, or higher income taxes for higher income earners. There are those economic solutions available if we are prepared to look for them, but it's very difficult to implement anything in Australia with a negative media and a carping opposition that is only out there to score political points.
I mean, I think it goes down to the courage of Labor. If you ignore Murdoch, I don't think they'll find that there's as big a public issue as Murdoch will tell you, or I'll be fair, the mainstream media. That includes Fairfax, the ABC, Channel 9, Channel 7. Not as many people are listening to it. And it seems that politicians of all stripes are more worried about it than certainly anyone outside of the media and politics. I think that if Labor showed more courage and just plainly ignored the media and just kept pushing their own narrative, they might find that they've got a more successful policy approach rather than trying to keep the media on side.
And just a general comment on economics. Over the past year or two, we've been commenting on that idea that global economics is going through quite a few structural changes, and we've seen the end of that failed experiment of neoliberalism, and that generally fits into global economic cycles that change roughly every 40 years or so. I think the prevailing thinking is, and this is certainly being encouraged by the US President Joe Biden, that neoliberalism and trickle-down economics has been a failure. So it's not just us that's been saying this. And many economic thinkers have been suggesting this for some time, and that new economic thinking is required. But the new Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, she seems to have forgotten about all of this and wants the world to embrace trickle-down economics again.
One of the things you're happy to see happen is for bankers to get bigger bonuses. Whose side are you on?
What I want to see is a growing economy, so everybody in our country has the high-paid jobs that they deserve.
That means the rich get richer,
and
that's fine.
If that means taking difficult decisions which are going to help Britain become more competitive, help Britain become more attractive, help more investment flow into our country, yes, I'm absolutely prepared to take those decisions, because what I care about is I care about our country being successful and everyone in our country, wherever they live, wherever they're from, having those opportunities.
So you're willing to do unpopular things if you think it can contribute to a bigger economy?
That's right.
Now, she is the British Prime Minister, although she was mistaken for a minor royal by the Australian media commentators this week. But I think that she's totally missing the point here. Trickle-down economics is dead. It's dead, buried, cremated, not necessarily in that order. But with comments like that, maybe Liz Truss would be better off becoming a minor member of the royal family, because it's old economic thinking that doesn't really fit into where we need to go into the future.
Joe Biden said he wants to build the economy from the bottom and then out at the middle, which, if is true, is something that we would support. Now, there's going to be a coterie of you who follow American politics who are going to find that skeptical. And of course, we should be skeptical whenever a world leader says anything that's half positive. But I do think that it's a public acknowledgement that the old way has failed. And really, it never succeeded. I don't know how much we can turn the clock back, so where we go back to nationalising banks, private healthcare being, and private education and all of that type of stuff being less of a drain on the public purse, etc. It's time for the Labor Party to grasp the nettle and go for reform. But despite having the means to be able to do this, they've got an upper house that seems prepared to work with them on certain things, and a majority in the House of Reps. You'd think that Labor might be a bit more brave. And you don't want to fall into the trap that they go to the next election and they retain government, but it's a minority government. And suddenly the negotiations in the lower house are a lot harder, because we can't guarantee it will be more progressive teals who get the balance of power. You could get non-teal independents, and suddenly your reform agenda is a lot more shaky. And a Senate that requires careful negotiation may stymie any chance at reform, and then you've got a lame duck government. Labor should use its first term to get as many of its reforms through as it should. And it's like the Whitlam years frightened it. But I don't think we'll ever go back to that either. I don't think the Liberal Party will get control of either house soon. Again, I understand that they've got to be careful that in the next half Senate election they don't lose more seats, etc. But if you reform and you reform well, and you are able to run a good campaign and retain your seats, if not gain, those reforms might be a lot less painful than they might have been.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through Amazon Music, Spotify, YouTube and SoundCloud, or you can find us at newpolitics.com.au. And you can also support New Politics through Patreon.
During the last election campaign, Anthony Albanese emphasised the point that he wanted Australia to become a renewable superpower. And the more often we hear about this, the more we'll start to believe in this, I guess. But it does have to be backed up with substance. And we will get a clearer picture of how we get to this renewable superpower status in the upcoming budget. The Australian Greens have been calling for the $1.9 billion fund that the Morrison government allocated towards a gas-led recovery and other fossil fuels projects. They've suggested that it should be reallocated towards renewable energy, and true to form, the Morrison government was too incompetent to spend that money, but at least it's one area of their incompetence that we can be grateful for. But if the Albanese government wants Australia to become a renewable superpower, it has to start matching up the rhetoric with action, and redirecting this $1.9 billion fund to renewables would be a good start.
The world economy is changing and the market is changing. Startups are less inclined to want to use the old nodes of power, running out of the old nodes of power anyway, possibly. And even so, they're not just monetarily expensive, but in terms of their effect on the environment, their effect in the atmosphere, their effect on public health, they're very expensive. All it takes is a government, and I'm sorry to be harping on this, with a little bit of will and a little bit of courage to embrace the change that needs to happen.
Well, that idea of the gas-led recovery, that was one of the Morrison government's responses to the pandemic in its earlier stages, and that was the COVID-19 Commission, which was stacked with fossil fuel executives. And I think a lot of people at the time were left wondering, well, what kind of response to a pandemic is a gas-led recovery? But if that money was not spent, it seems to be a sensible idea to redirect it towards something that is in line with the government's renewable energy agenda. And I think there's also been a change in consumer sentiment and market forces, and that's the area that the Liberal Party always bangs on about but seems to ignore. But I've been away from Sydney for most of this year, as you know, David, but when I returned a few weeks ago, just in my local area, I've come across 6 electric charging stations which were not there before, and I've also noticed more electric cars on the road. Now, I'm not actually a car spotter, so there could actually be more out there that I'm not seeing, and this is on the edge of the inner west area of Sydney, so it might not be indicative of the growth of electric vehicles in other parts of Sydney, but I think it does show that there's a greater interest in the electorate. And again, let's see how committed the federal government is to this idea of a renewables superpower in the budget. But it does end up having to be a balancing act with workers in fossil fuel industries looking at new opportunities in the renewable industries. And there will be great resistance from conservative forces and vested interests who want to have the right to continue polluting the world forever. But these opportunities do have to be taken up, and these changes do need to happen.
Nothing is inevitable, but I think there's a point where if we don't adopt them, there'll be changes that will be very, very hard to reverse. In any reform you do, and this is where the last 9 years of Liberal government was unusual in that there seemed to be no thought of what will the history books say. Most prime ministers should have an eye on, am I going to be one of the good people or one of the bad people? And that's part of the weight of the decisions that a prime minister makes. It seems that Scott Morrison had no clue that in decades' time, they could be remembered in such a way that might be beneficial to them, in a way that Robert Menzies, Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating are remembered. Even their detractors acknowledge that they did some good things. Even John Howard, the left, praises, or at least acknowledges that it wasn't a bad thing, his reform to gun law. And he had to face down people who were very much on his side till that point. It seemed he did it because it was the right thing to do. And at the time, it was good politics. Bob Hawke, with his reforming of the economy, with, say, the Accords, he had to stare down a lot of people nominally on his side who thought they were a bad idea. Now, of course, we could argue that all of this didn't work well, and that's fine. But these are substantial achievements that change things in some ways for the better, at least temporarily. The last 9 years of Liberal government haven't really done that much, except I think I've pointed out before, same-sex marriage. One of the odd things about particularly Morrison is the lack of what will this mean in the future? What legacy am I leaving? Except a negative one, and that some of our donors got a bit richer.
And speaking of former Prime Ministers, a few people have asked us, well, whatever happened to Tony Abbott? And Tony Abbott has been reappointed to the board of the Australian War Memorial, and it seems like it's a lost opportunity for the Labor Party to start cleaning out all of the appointments made by the coalition during their time in office. Most of the War Memorial Board in Canberra, they've got connections to the coalition. The owner of Seven West Media, Kerry Stokes, he was the chair of the council, and he's a substantial donor to the Liberal Party. Not sure why he was on the board in the first place anyway. But more importantly, there are no historians on the board, and this is a little bit strange for a memorial of historical significance. These kinds of appointments should be made in the best interests of the public and for the institution concerned. But is it time for Labor to start appointing its own people? The coalition always cleans out boards and institutions once they get it back into office or once they get back into government and start putting in their own. But is it time for the Labor government to start putting in their own people?
I don't know that they should put in their own people, but they should put in historians, veterans, some ex-military senior staff. I don't think that's actually terribly inappropriate. Under the Howard years, and then there was a bit of a winding back during the Rudd Gillard years. But what had happened is that Anzac Day became this gauche celebration of nationalism. And not only that, we're building these hideously expensive memorials while we're ignoring the survivors. Now, I'm all for solemn memorialisation, tasteful ceremony, a day off, a chance to reflect upon the meaning of conflict, upon the meaning of war, but also a chance to remember not only those who didn't come back, but those who did come back and are physically damaged, mentally damaged, emotionally damaged. There seems to be a lot less care on that. And I will be fair too, very few governments have actually treated veterans properly. You have alcoholism, drug issues, crime issues, because people just aren't looked after well enough. What we need is less focus on the memorials and more on making sure that those that have gone over are looked after. Yeah, rather than letting Kerry Stokes idealise Victoria Cross winners and building that massive memorial at Passchendaele or at the Somme or somewhere.
Oh, well, I guess these memorials do need to be created, but there needs to be an idea of what they actually represent and how much money is actually spent on that. But $500 million was allocated to the renovation of the Australian War Memorial, and I guess the point is that we should reconsider how that money is being used and push it into other areas of greater concern. The way that these people are appointed to these boards needs to be considered as well. And I'm not suggesting that only one side of politics stacks these particular boards and institutions. All sides of politics have stacked boards and institutions with their own people for as long as anyone can remember. But the coalition seems to be quite malicious and ruthless in their appointments. We have to remember that the former Victoria Premier, Steve Bracks, he was appointed by the Labor government in 2013 to be the Consul General in New York, but was sacked by Julie Bishop when the coalition got into government. Kevin Rudd wasn't supported by the coalition in his quest to become the Secretary-General of the United Nations, but the coalition did everything possible to get Matthias Cormann into the position of the head of the OECD. When Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, he appointed former Liberal leader Brendan Nelson as ambassador to the European Union. He then appointed former Liberal Treasurer Peter Costello as the head of the Future Fund. Rudd also never interfered with the ABC. The Liberal Party never takes these acts by the Labor government or by Labor when they're in government into account in their future appointments. They just ride roughshod over protocols and decency in government, and they just appoint their own people and interfere politically with every board and every institution that they ever get involved with. But of course, Labor does appoint their own people when they get the chance, but appointing the best person or the right person just never seems to be the consideration for the coalition. It's always a matter of putting in some sort of Conservative person or Liberal Party connection, irrespective of what their credentials are, even if it's not in the best interests of that institution. And perhaps if we did get the right people into these positions, something like that $500 million that was allocated to the Australian War Memorial might be used for better purposes.
And again, I'm not opposed to the solemn memorialisation. I don't think we need to fetishise them as exemplars of Aussie mateship, etc. But I think while we have veterans of wars that we tend not to talk about, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, they might be relatively small numbers, but they're still people who did their very best under circumstances that most of us will never ever see. And sure, we've found that there were some bad eggs among things and that there are some things we need to sort out in terms of war crimes. These things need to be investigated and gone through. And I'm certainly not trying to excuse anyone from war crimes either. But if we want to look after our veterans, we should look after them rather than look after the dead. It's easy to look after the dead, they don't complain.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through Amazon Music, Spotify, YouTube and SoundCloud, or you can find us at newpolitics.com.au. And you can also support New Politics through Patreon.
Whatever happened to Leon Trotsky? He got an ice pick that made his ears burn. Whatever happened to dear old Lenin, the great O'Meara?
based on past behaviour, we can see that Conservatives are not keen to observe protocols or follow the rules and laws that are expected of everybody else. And so it was when former Prime Minister Scott Morrison created a Cabinet Office Policy Committee, where he was the only permanent member. We've actually known about this one-person committee for some time, but it just meant that Morrison could pretty much meet with whoever he wanted to, claim it that it was a Cabinet Office Policy Committee meeting, and then lock up the information about it for 20 years. There has been new information that has arisen, and that was requested by former Senator Rex Patrick under Freedom of Information laws, and it shows that there were 739 sets of minutes that were recorded from these meetings, but 665 sets of those are unaccounted for, and we might actually find Barnaby Joyce's drought envoy report in there if we're lucky. But at this stage, we're not entirely sure what the behaviour of this committee was, but whatever it was working against the principles of democratic government and more in keeping with how secretive governments like to operate.
It's clear that Morrison may not have been a fascist, but he had fascist tendencies, the love of secrecy. And the way the media howled about Kevin Rudd being this micromanager who no one could work with, as far as I know, Kevin Rudd never formed a committee of one without at least telling everybody about it and explaining why. There weren't any huge surprises at the end of the Rudd governments or the end of the Gillard governments, or, let's be fair, the end of the Howard governments. The surprises tended to be, we owed a bit more money than we suggested we did, or this department was a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. And that's not great, but there was no outrageous abuse of power in that kind of way. It's something that all governments did, sometimes for reasonable reasons, unforeseen circumstances, or poorly thought through policy that was spinning out of control. I'm not saying that's a reasonable, but it's the reason things happen sometimes. Not this absolute disregard for how things work in Australia. And for a man who wore the Australian flag on his coat lapel, improperly by the way, for a man who claimed to be an Australian, he certainly did a whole lot of un-Australian things and things we don't like in this country, mate, quote, that is really appalling to people like ourselves who've looked at how the Australian polity has worked. It's absolutely appalling, and we've got to ensure that nobody like Morrison gets anywhere near high office ever again.
And there's been more published polls this week, and it's pretty much the same ever since Labor won the federal election in May this year. There's been a slight dip in support for the Labor government, but the approval for Anthony Albanese is more or less the same as before. But support for the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has gone down further. He's preferred Prime Minister by 17% of the electorate, while Anthony Albanese is at 55%, and the two-party preferred vote for Labor is 57%, which means that it's 43% for the coalition. So far away from an election, these polls are meaningless. We keep pointing this out, but it does give us some perspective on how the major parties are travelling, and it's easier for a government to do what it needs to do if the opposition is in disarray. Most of the electorate has been preoccupied with events in Britain, but Albanese is just doing what he needs to do. He was at the Queen's funeral during the week, even though the international media didn't seem to know who he was. But the more he appears at these events, and he was in the presence of the King as well, and the more that he keeps doing the things that we'd normally expect to see of a Prime Minister, the more likely he is to keep those high ratings.
I think I've said this before. It's actually nice being able to criticise a government that is competent, that where we can look at why might they have done that and know that the answer isn't for some kind of rot or corruption necessarily. I'm not going to let them off the hook and assume that everything that the government does is honest and above board and by the book. That's not good analysis. But nearly everything they've done has been explicable, even if we haven't liked it. So the tax cuts, as we discussed before, well, they were kind of given them to them and they're politically stuck with them, possibly. And even the policy on Julian Assange isn't about, it seems to me, bullying Assange, but there seems to be deals, I think, that are done outside of public knowledge that may be forcing the government's hand in this stuff. We don't know. Again, I'm not excusing it, and we will still continue to criticise this stuff, but it's a lot different criticising a capable and competent government. Even if it's not a very good government, I'm not saying that one way or the other, but it's different to the clown show that we just got rid of. they seem to have been blindsided by all these protocols that nobody really knew that much about. Having the day off, or 15-day mourning period, or 15 or 16-day mourning period. Of course, the Prime Minister should fly to the funeral of the head of state. Whether we think the monarch should be the head of state is another debate, of course, which we have had and will continue to have here. But that in itself wasn't inappropriate. And there's a sense too, just between you and I, listeners, that aren't we glad that it was Anthony Albanese and not Scott Morrison representing Australia at the funeral? But that's just between us.
Oh, well, there's all those protocols or adhering to those protocols can change the perception of a leader or change the perception of the government. There's also a wide range of other events that can change the perceptions of the leader and the government. The budget is expected to be harsh. The petrol excise is going back to its full level next week. There's those costs of living pressures that we go on about. But also, Albanese's ratings are high because Peter Dutton's are so low. The longer Albanese stays in the position, the more prime ministerial he looks. And that's just not a plug for Albanese. It's just a self-inherent truth that all the people that we couldn't imagine as prime minister become more prime ministerial because they're actually the prime minister. We no longer need to imagine it. It's actually the fact. But I think we will get a better understanding of whether these figures or opinion polling figures become more settled after the budget announcement in October and the reaction to the budget. There are other polls for Victoria and New South Wales as well. The next election coming up is the one in Victoria in November, and according to the recent polls, the Andrews government will be returned with possibly an increased majority. The next election after that is in New South Wales in March 2023. But current polls are suggesting either a minority parliament with an outside chance of a narrow Labor victory. Now, there's still a little while for this to play out, but the New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, does seem to have a better working relationship with Anthony Albanese than he did with Scott Morrison, and this could end up working in favour of the New South Wales Liberal Party at the New South Wales election in March 2023. But in a few months' time, after March 2023, there's a possibility that all the mainland governments will be held by Labor. Tasmania has a Liberal government down there. In 2008, for a brief period, every government across Australia was held by the Labor Party, and that's the only time that this has ever happened. But with the domination of the Labor Party across most of Australia, what will this mean for federal-state relationships? Anthony Albanese did promise better relationships with the states in the last federal election campaign, so achieving this might end up being a lot easier for him.
It's always hard. Again, the interests of state Labor governments can be different to the interests of federal Labor governments, and that's true too of the Liberal Party or any party really. Look at how the Greens argue with each other, for example, and I'm not there slamming the Greens. All parties have difficulties.
Well, there's quite a vast difference between the Australian Greens and the New South Wales Greens, for example.
Exactly, yeah. I think it was Henry Bolte who, when the COAG met, and it wasn't called COAG then, but back in the early 60s, he'd say, well, I'm off to lock in mortal combat with Bob Menzies again, even though they were both ostensibly of the same party. But Bolte was Victorian and Menzies was federal. Of course, Menzies was from Victoria, so you'd think that they'd have similar interests, but in fact they didn't. Menzies, of course, had to balance the interests of the whole country, and this is true of Albanese too. He's got to make sure that Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Queensland and the territories get their fair share, and that it's not just carved up by the bigger states, but he can't ignore the claims of the bigger states. It's easier when it's, say, a Liberal government at one level and a Labor government at the other, because you can look magnanimous and strong and fair, whereas it's probably easier to be mean to the people of your own party in some ways. And again, done properly, it should all transcend party issues and should be state governments representing the state and federal governments representing the federal, and deals being hammered out that benefits everybody. But in reality, it's not really like that.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through Amazon Music, Spotify, YouTube and SoundCloud, or you can find us at newpolitics.com.au. And you can also support New Politics through Patreon.
tiring, always stretching out for something that's just out of reach. But I'll get it. After all, what I want isn't as easy as all that. I've got to do 400 miles an hour, turn on a sixpence, climb 10,000 feet in a few minutes, dive at 500 without the wings coming off, carry 8 machine guns.
Hello, Hunter Leader. Bandits approaching Beachy from southeast, Angels 1-5, over. Bandits are now about 3 to 4 miles south of Beachy. You should see them in a minute, they're down south of you. Hello, Hunter Leader, flammer control calling, can you see them? Can you see them?
And life is slowly getting back to normal after the insane media coverage of the death of the Queen over the past 2 weeks, and we've been criticised for not showing enough respect for the monarch. Others have said that we showed too much respect, but whatever we say, New Politics is an independent podcast and we do have high listener numbers, but whatever we say here is probably not going to be enough to bring on the revolution. But we are adamant that the discussions for the future of Australia do have to start right now. And the longer it goes on, the more chances there are of complacency setting in and nothing ever changing. We reported a Morgan poll last week which suggested 60% support for the monarchy, 40% opposed, and this week an Essential poll suggested a 50-50 split for King Charles as head of state for Australia, and 43% support for a move to a republic and 37% support for remaining a monarchy, which has moved upwards quite substantially over the past 3 months. It's hard to know exactly what this means because no model has been proposed at this stage, and it's a relatively abstract concept because an Australian head of state and how that's chosen will mean different things to different people. But confusion and a polarised support means that any referendum on a republic, whenever it actually happens, can be easily defeated. And I think that's why the process has to be carefully constructed.
Paul Keating at the end of the 99 referendum said they got it wrong. They should have asked the question first. Do you wish Australia to be a republic? Yes or no? And then started looking at the model rather than presenting a model as a fait accompli. That's probably right. And I suspect most people back then anyway were quite happy for the really a nominal change where the Governor-General becomes a president and the Commonwealth becomes the Republic of Australia. Now I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure because I haven't seen any polling on what people want, and I do think that Labor has dropped the ball a little bit in sort of saying, oh, it won't be this term. They could start the debate at least this term, even if it's something that they aim to do the referendum next term. And I do understand that the voice to Parliament is extremely important and you don't want that derailed by other issues. So I do get that. But I think the two of them together, if they could get them both happening, would be a very powerful statement of Australia finally moving into the 21st century, 22 or 23 years too late.
Well, this higher level of support for the monarchy at the moment is probably a reflection of the support for the Queen, and there are suggestions that in 6 months' time less people will care about King Charles, and there's also the possibility that it just won't be on the radar at all. Australia is resistant to constitutional change, and the reasons for the changes that have occurred in other countries that have left the monarchy have usually been brought about by social upheaval and political change, or wanting to shed issues related to colonisation. And colonisation had a significant effect on Indigenous people in Australia, but these issues don't exist for enough people at the moment to force this change. And a few people have asked us, well, they're thoroughly sick of King Charles already. When's the Republic going to come? And sorry to disappoint, but it's probably not going to happen for some time to come. We did suggest last week that a move to a republic needs to start now. But when you look through the political timetable and the schedule, well, first of all, Anthony Albanese wants to focus on the voice to Parliament first. Some people have suggested that a vote on the republic could take place at the same time as the election in 2025. Generally, governments don't like to hold referenda questions at the same time as an election because it dilutes the messages hovering around the election and for the referendum questions as well. So if Labor wins the 2025 election, perhaps a vote on the Republic in 2026 or 2027. And this is probably the schedule if King Charles becomes a benign and forgettable character. He just resides in Buckingham Palace. He's not seen of or heard of, just does his business over there. But if there are scandals, if there's allegations made against Prince Andrew of sexual abuse or his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, or if Charles has his annus horribilis, there might be a fast tracking of the Republic in 2024. But aside from this, we might be stuck with the symbols that don't represent us as a country for a little while longer. But if I was Anthony Albanese, I'd be getting that Assistant Minister for the Republic to start doing some work on this now to see if that change could happen as early as 2024.
The Australian Republican movement probably should start ramping up its campaign and be a bit more hard-nosed about it. Several models should be proposed so that we can discuss them fully and properly. I think that the mainstream media should be ignored in all of this because they're of no help to these serious debates. It's something that could progress a whole lot of other things, or it's something that could change nothing. My own fear of a president will just be the same mob of routers and con artists who cover up everything else. But you never know. A good, swift broom might just clean everything out and we start to get a model that works and reflects what modern Australia is. And that modern Australia is not this kowtowing monarchist tied for reasons that aren't always clear to a very quickly declining power that continues to shoot itself in the foot. I know that Charles himself has encouraged Australia to become a republic and is surprised that it hasn't already happened. So offending Charles is not going to be an issue. And he was there when Hong Kong, who I would argue is a much more symbolic notion of the British Empire, when it went back to Chinese rule in 97, Charles was there presiding over it. So I don't think Australia leaving will offend him terribly much. So that's an argument that we can all ignore because Charles, I think, probably has somewhat of a more mature view of these things than some of the people who support him.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. If you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.